Good morning or good afternoon, and welcome to today's program and webinar, part of the highly acclaimed series of webinars that ACP, the Association of Contingency Planners, presents for both current and future members. For more information about ACP, please visit www.acp-international.com. My name is Ed Goldberg, and it is my honor to host these webinars. My thanks to Gianna and ACP's headquarters staff at ADG in Albany, and my good friend Fred Rogers at Continuity Housing for their roles as webinar experts who work behind the scenes to ensure that these webinars happen flawlessly. And a big thanks to our webinar series sponsor, Continuity Housing. Continuity Housing guarantees pre-negotiated hotel rooms at substantial savings for the critical employees of larger and mid-sized companies in order to prevent the business disruptions in the event of a crisis. They've created a patent-pending guaranteed employee housing program which secures and protects the hotel rooms for for critical personnel and their families if needed, while saving companies significant expense. Continuity Housing has a 100% success record with their deployments, and each member of their team has at least 10 years of experience. For information on receiving a free 30-minute consultation about your deployment housing needs, please visit continuityhousing.com or leave a comment in the survey that will pop up at the end of the webinar. This and previous webinars are recorded and made available on the ACP website. Please feel free to share the link to the recordings with your peers and anyone you think might benefit from it. You'll receive a link to the recording after the webinar via email, along with any additional information on the topical content. And help us out if you would. If you have an idea for a webinar topic, please send it to fred.rogers@continuityhousing.com. And if you like these webinars, please tell your friends about ACP. Among the most popular webinar topics we've presented have been updates, like today's, on the standard-making processes that eventually affect our work dramatically. Today we're going to cover recent developments in the ISO Technical Committee 292 security standard and the standard-making process. Brian Zawada is a co-founder of Evaluation Consulting, and he is the director of consulting there. Brian was chairman of the U.S. Technical Advisory Group, U.S. TAG, to the former ISO TC 223 Societal Security. He leads the project team responsible for developing a technical specification for business impact analysis. Brian is also president of the Business Continuity Institute's United States chapter. Duncan Ford is a partner of Corpus LLP. Duncan has over 20 years experience in crisis and business continuity management, with a background that includes implementing business continuity and crisis programs in a wide range of business sectors. He's actively involved in extending continuity management into the supply chain, from risk identification to supplier assessment and contracts. Duncan leads the ISO project team responsible for supply chain continuity management. George Huff is the founder of the Continuity Project, LLC, and director of consulting. He's a member of the National Corporate Board of Directors of ACP and ACP's District of Columbia chapter. George is also a member of the Board of Directors of ANSI ASQ, the National Accreditation Board, which assesses and accredits certification bodies that demonstrate competence to audit and certify organizations conforming to management system standards. He participates on ISO's project teams on BCMS, BIA, and SCCM. From November 10th to the 14th last year, today's presenters met in Cleveland, Ohio, with project teams assembled to develop ISO TS 22317, Business Impact Analysis, and ISO TS 22318, Guidance on Supply Chain. Today they'll report on the status of these emerging ISO societal security standards, including their value to our discipline and the organizations we advise. In addition, they'll describe the 2015 transition of ISO Technical Committee 223 Societal Security and other existing ISO technical committees to ISO TC 292 Security, including the new TC's interim structure and work program. I urge you to provide the presenters with your questions and feedback. You can do that on that side panel on your screen. And please join me in welcoming Brian, Duncan, and George. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are.
All right, thanks, Ed. Hello, everyone. This is Brian Zawada, and I'll start off the presentation and talk just a little bit about really the TC 223, also now known as TC 292, Regardless, it focuses on security. And for those that have not participated in these webinars before on some of our updates, you might look at this and say, well, wait a minute, I thought these guys are doing standards around business continuity, which is why ACP is putting these on. And really, when you look at the word security internationally, it's not all about guns, guards, gates, bullets, that type of thing. It's all about preparedness. And so today, we'll talk about two of those standards that we've been working on, as well as just really the entire body of work that the new TC292 is going to be working on. As Ed mentioned, it was my pleasure to host in Cleveland a number of the working or the project teams that were working on three of the standards, that being on organizational resilience, the BIA, and supply chain continuity. We're not going to talk about organizational resilience today, but I'll start off by talking about the business impact analysis, that being the project that I lead, and then Duncan will talk about the supply chain continuity side of the house. So with that being said, what you see here on the slide is a brief overview and a relationship of the business impact analysis standard that is currently being developed. It's known as a technical specification, and without trying to get into all the gory details about standards development, essentially it's a streamlined process to develop a standard. It's a little bit more of the how-to, step-by-step, technical. It's got a lot more technical detail. But the relationship here is simply this. When we chartered this project, we recognized that in ISO 22301, there's only about 10 lines, really about 115 words dedicated to the topic of business impact analysis. It very much talked about what you needed to do for a BIA, but it certainly, and by design, did not talk about how. So that was a requirements document available for certification. It's a specification. But there was also another document, a little bit more of the how-to across the entire business continuity management system. That was ISO 22313. But again, it didn't go into a lot of detail, shall we say. And so there was still a market need. We heard over and over again that organizations and individuals wanted more, and that's ultimately where ISO 22317 comes into play. So this is going to be a new document. We hope to publish it this year. It really depends on the outcome of our next meeting in Japan in the March timeframe. But again, this is something that's going to go into much greater detail about how to do a BIA. What's it all about? What's the value? What are the outcomes? Recommendations on process, so on and so forth. So again, this is designed to be able to address that specific market need. So we go to the next slide, please. Just to give you a little bit more detail, we've had a chance as part of the project team for ISO 22317. We've met 3 times so far. We met in South Africa the first time in January of, 2 years ago, June the same year, and then November in Cleveland, as we indicated about 2 slides ago. Made considerable progress. We have some great people. We have folks that author books on the topic of business impact analysis, as well as a lot of people with just some practical hands-on experience in organizations of all sizes and all sectors. But the idea here was we started with defining what is a business impact analysis. And you can see the overall definition there. The BIA is a process for analyzing the consequences of a disruptive incident on the organization. So simply put, that's it. And that ultimately results, as I'll talk about in just a few moments, a statement of business continuity requirements. And so very much this definition was designed to align and be consistent with ISO 22301. But as a project team, we decided that it wasn't mandatory that you had to use 22301 or have a business continuity management system per se. You could go ahead and use this as a standalone document to design or improve the business impact analysis process in your organization. So that's really what we focused on. Like so many standards or technical specifications, we had a forward, an introduction, a scope. The way we worked this is we had 3 main clauses and then a series of annexes to provide additional information. It ultimately resulted, at least so far, in about 29 pages of content. And so right now that document is out for review, and by, I guess it's almost 2 weeks from now, we should have all comments in so that we can go ahead and aggregate those and prepare for our next meeting in March in Japan to review them. So all in all here, the goal, just the point I want to make is that even if you're not a fan of 22301 or you're not implementing a management system, this is still something that can provide a lot of value because it does offer considerable perspective on the overall BIA process. Now, the next two slides are going to comment on the outcomes of the BIA process. We spent a lot of time on this, and it really dates back to some work we did in South Africa, but a lot of work we did when we were in Switzerland 2 meetings ago. The focus here was to say, well, it seems like we struggle because not everyone agrees as to what are we trying to get out of the business impact analysis process. So we started our project work there and then worked backwards to develop a process to deliver on these outcomes. Again, not everybody needs to realize the benefit of all of them, but the standard itself focuses on really each of these 8 primary outcomes. First and foremost, it's either we're using the results to endorse or potentially seek modification of a business continuity management program scope statement, and certainly that can be products and services, processes, activities, resources, so on and so forth. In 22301, when we set up the business continuity management system, we worked to identify legal, regulatory, contractual requirements that might influence the design of the program. But the BIA is really all about doing the same, but working to identify those not just to influence the design of the program, but also to be focused on the specific business continuity requirements. So that's certainly an outcome. And then we also talk about really requirements for product and service delivery. And again, that helps to kind of set the stage for priorities for business activities and subordinate resources. Again, you can kind of say that that's working towards what we commonly call RTOs and RPOs, but it's also other performance aspects as well. Another outcome is just really the identification of or establishing the relationships between products and services, the organization's processes, its activities, getting a little bit more granular, and of course resources, that being facilities, people, equipment, information technology, and also the suppliers and business partners. So again, all in all, when we talk about this, these are just 4. So we go to the next slide, you see the other 4. And what we've got here is saying, well, we have to figure out what are the resources we would need to perform our most highly prioritized activities. Again, some of those same resources I just mentioned a few moments ago. I didn't mention financing before, but that's certainly one of them. But again, what do we need to be able to do our work independent of the disruption that's taking place? We certainly want to understand dependencies both internal and external, different organizations or different parts of our own organizations. We certainly want to understand the impacts over time, and that could be not only the time, the capability to deliver work, and the quality of the work. Notice that's not just RTOs and RPOs. And then lastly, trying to determine required currency of information, whether that be electronic, hard copy. What is that, the lifeblood of the organization? It's always information and data. Well, how current does it need to be when we recover? So these 8 outcomes really serve as an input in strategy, in the strategy selection process. But really what it comes down to, it is a statement of business continuity requirements. And that's ultimately what we put as the definition of BIA in this new technical specification. Now on this next slide you see here, it's a little bit of a process flow. And we inserted this early on in the technical specification, and we linked it to the different clauses just to be a visual representation of the business impact analysis. So if you, in that blue box, if you start at the 12 o'clock position, it's really a decision making with top management, executive management on priorities. There's process mapping, meaning mapping processes to products and services. And then we move on into more of that 5 o'clock position of really diving into the activity level, which maps back to processes, but also includes thinking about the resources needed to do work. Then there's the analysis component, was understanding the potential impacts that may result associated with downtime, influencing, again, business continuity requirements, so time, capability, quality. And then being able to summarize that for both repeatability's sake to aid in decision making and aid in presenting to management so they can endorse the work, leading to that green box strategy identification. Now, a couple things I point out in gray on this diagram is there are some prerequisites to doing a BIA. Whether it's, again, linked to ISO 22301, a management system, or a program, really our project team identified a number of different things that really are prerequisites before you do a BIA. Scope and objectives of your program, policy to drive engagement, and ultimately roles and commitment. Roles meaning in the program, those that are going to be offering input, those that are going to be signing off on results or providing feedback, and then of course commitment. So a lot of different things here, but again, this kind of gives you a visual description of the process that's described in the technical specification, again linking to the clauses, so kind of a visual table of contents, if you will. Now on the next slide is something that it also is kind of a visual representation of the table of contents, but this is one where if you look at all the way at the bottom there in that gray box, it might be hard to see on your screen, but it says time. And what we're saying here is that if we're doing a business impact analysis process, early on, some of the first things we're going to do is use common project planning and management tasks. But you can see here in those boxes in the middle that say top management, process owners, activity managers. These are the people we're going to engage kind of in order over that time continuum. And here's the work we're going to do. We're going to start with, again, prioritizing products and services, prioritizing business processes, and then, of course, prioritizing activities together with understanding resources and interdependencies. And again, leads into analysis. It's going to lead to getting management endorsement of the results, and then eventually strategy selection. So again, looking left to right on the time continuum, you can kind of see the overlap of tasks, but you can also see the progression as well. And so again, the goal here is to show that, a BIA, it's a recurring activity. You almost can treat it like a project, but there's multiple layers, whether that be strategic, operational, or tactical, that ultimately lead to helping to scope, prioritize, and set business continuity requirements. We look at the next slide. We always talk about impact. Impact is certainly the justification for making an investment in business continuity, helps us to determine business continuity requirements. And so one of the things that we did in this standard was to try to provide an overview to the reader that there are many different types of impacts. Not all about financial. It could be reputational, could be legal, regulatory, contractual, potentially fines, which could definitely bleed into financial. There's a lot of different things, but when you stack them all up, whether you were able to quantify them or it's more of a qualitative technique, when you start seeing that spike, maybe that helps you understand when something needs to return to some minimum capability. So that's what this graphic is trying to display here. And so we inserted this in the standard right around the impact area, with the goal being how do we go ahead and analyze results in order to determine business continuity requirements. So again, not just time, but capability, but ultimately we're trying to say the impact certainly influences all of that, and here's one just example of a graphic representation. Okay, so we'll go to the next slide here. This is the last slide before I turn it over to Duncan to talk about supply chain continuity. But one of the things I want to point out, and I mentioned it briefly before, is that we have a series of annexes in this document, and we chose to put them in there because there's so many different ways to do so many different things in the BIA. And so we have annexes around how do you go ahead and collect information, how might you do analysis techniques, and so many different things. But one example is, how do you collect the information for a BIA? And that's what we have as an example here. Whether it's reviewing documents, doing interviews, surveying, workshop, and even using kind of an exercise technique to gather information. But regardless, there's a lot of different ways, and so the main body talks about the process, and then we've reserved some additional content for review in the annex, or annexes, to be able to go ahead and, again, provide some additional value. So all 29 pages really do provide the reader many different ways and approaches for the BIA, all leading to the 8 outcomes that I've presented. So we'll talk questions later on, but what I'd like to do now is turn it over to my colleague Duncan, who'll talk about supply chain continuity.
Thank you, Brian. And here's my first slide, which looks very similar to the one Brian had earlier, except, of course, we've got 22318 at the bottom here. And I think this makes the important point with these technical specifications that we're writing, that they're actually there to, as Brian said, to augment the information that's in 22301. We're not trying to undermine these 2 core standards, which are the ones against which people can be certified to demonstrate their business continuity capability and their business continuity management system that's in place. If we move on to the next slide, which is talking about the scope of this particular document, 22318, which is looking at giving guidance on supply chain continuity management. And specifically, we're not trying to do the whole supply chain management problem. It's looking at the issues that arise and how they're going to be managed, or how they can be managed, in the event that there is disruption in that supply chain which is impacting your business or your organization. It's what we're trying to do in every case is to make sure that this information doesn't contradict what is there, and to provide a model and a structure which all sorts of businesses can use, or any sort of organization can use, to look down at its supply chain. Every business has got a supply chain, and that may include both conventional external suppliers who are providing things. It also can look at the provision of services, which may also come from an internal arrangement where there is some cross-business arrangement, perhaps for an IT department, a group IT department or similar, to provide support. But you as a business need to make sure those services are available. And I think one of the key important points on this slide is at the bottom there, is that the supply chain continuity management is dependent on the BIA and the work that Brian's been talking about to identify and prioritize those business activities which are critical to the organization, the highest priority ones, and those products or activities which, if they don't continue, will lead to the business running into trouble. If we step forward onto the next slide, here again, similar approach to Brian's. It's trying to map what this document is saying against the model that's in 22301. And the diagram on the right-hand side is the 22301 model, which shows the requirement for operational planning and control in the centre, and then the business impacts analysis, risk assessments at the top, developing the business continuity strategies, implementing those strategies, and then conducting exercising and testing to demonstrate that it all works. In the same way, the main operating clauses of 22318 map to the same places. And on the left, I've identified the 5 clauses in the document which map exactly onto that core model. So what I'm going to do now is just step through the key points in each of those models and the way each of those clauses. The way we've structured the document is that within each section, each clause, there is a final paragraph which says these are the key points we're talking about here. Trying to make it an easy access document which both customers and suppliers can access to understand the expectation of a good relationship. So moving forward onto the first one, we'll talk about why supply chain continuity is important. Now, this may seem a fairly obvious statement for many of us. We know that our supply chains are there and we need them. But it's interesting that increasingly there is greater and greater dependency on the supply chain, both for goods but also for services. Many organisations are stepping away from the things which are not core to their business and putting them out through an outsource or similar arrangement, which counts as part of the supply chain. So what we're actually looking at is any part of your structure which delivers inputs to you that are not under your direct management or control. You can't dictate what's going to happen. It's a global, interconnected, fast-moving world which we understand, and globalization is making this harder in that this understanding of the supply chain has got to look at what is going on in the countries from which those supplies are coming, where you've got different regulatory environments, different expectations, from people of what is normal and what can be expected to happen. And in our planning for how we put continuity into our supply chain, we've got to take those things into account. Which I think brings us to the key point in this one, is that you can't outsource the risk. It's your risk. If your supplier doesn't provide to you and you can't deliver to your customers, it's your problem, not theirs. So you need to have in place some organisation which says, I can understand and cope with this, an interruption in the supply chain. And what we're looking for from a supplier is this demonstrated continuity capability, so that we know that they will be there when we need them. And ideally what we want to see happen is that that gets built into the contract for the delivery of those services as part of the main SLA. Stepping forward into the detail, the first area very much looks like the BIA. It's analysing our supply chain. Large organisations have very many suppliers, and interestingly, when you do the analysis, relatively few of those suppliers are really, really important to the business. Many of them are providing resources which, if we can't get them, we can get them from somewhere else, or we can actually survive without them because we carry a sufficient stock. But what we need to do is to make sure we apply a standard approach to this analysis of our supply chain, and we need to set up those core criteria within our own organisation. What do we expect our suppliers to be able to do, depending on how important they are to us? Which allows us to come out with the key outputs from the analysis, very similar to what we get out of the BIA, which is an overall assessment of the level of risk posed by the supply chain and by particular individual suppliers within that. We also have to recognise that this is a dynamic world and these things are continuously changing. So we need to have a process which is repeatable and maintainable over time. Okay, having worked out where our supply risks are and who's important to us, the next thing we need to do is to look at the strategies we can use in order to protect ourselves from disruption, which is then our next slide. Now, every supplier, in a perfect world, you would have an appropriate supply chain continuity strategy for them. It will take time to get to this level, so let's make sure we focus on the most important ones at the beginning and then work through. It will take time to implement a program. Indeed, where there are long-term supply contracts in place with complex contract clauses, it may take a considerable amount of time to improve the relationship, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't start. Ideally, we should look at strategies which allow our organisation to reduce the impact of disruption independent of an individual supplier. Things we can think of, or approaches you can think of, is having more than one supplier. But obviously that may not be the most cost-efficient way to operate. You've got to take a risk decision. Similarly, we can actually take some fairly simple steps, perhaps to increase our stock holding so that we are able to tolerate disruption for a bit longer. It comes with a cost. Where are you going to put the extra stock? How are you going to store it? How are you going to keep it in date? They're all decisions you can make when you've got the information about what the options are to you. And out of that work, you then come up that there are some suppliers where I've actually got to pressure them to understand what their arrangements are within their business to ensure that they can continue to support us and they have an effective business continuity solution, which extends on down their own supply chain too, because every supplier is also a customer, as a general statement, till you get right the way down to the bottom of the chain. We need to get evidence from those suppliers of what their continuity arrangements are, both at the time the contract is awarded, as I've said there, and indeed as part of our ongoing assurance to ensure that they maintain the standard. And we need to have decided what the quality of that evidence is. It isn't, for a critical supplier, it isn't just that we receive a copy of their business continuity plan and assume that it works. We may want to go and see their exercises, get evidence that they actually do something with the action points from that and improve their planning. And we want to build a relationship with the supplier. And it's important that with these suppliers that we do actually make this a two-way street, that we work together to improve the solution, because it's good value to everybody. And ultimately, as I've said, we want to make sure this is built into the contracting process. And we need to train the procurement guys to actually understand what we're talking about in terms of the required strategies. So there's an education piece with our own people in there that we need to take account of. The next area is actually about implementing this, which is clause 7. And it's very much about ensuring that we communicate with those suppliers. We want to make sure that our own continuity plans explain how supply chain continuity arrangements will work for those key suppliers. so that the information is available in the event of an upset. We need to make sure the suppliers know how to tell us if they've got a problem, and that we've got a good enough communication process in place that they will do that early, so that we can prepare for and make things simpler and reduce the impact of a problem. We need to have an arrangement with those key suppliers that ensures we can work together. Perhaps a key person from their team joins our continuity management team and is frequently involved in our exercises, so they understand our priorities as well. And we also need to ultimately coordinate external communication plans, because we really don't want a supplier putting out a press release about the problem they've got which impacts our business, certainly not without us knowing about it. So a key point there during the operation is regular open discussion with parties to create a partnership and we don't want this thing to look adversarial. If we can help it, it's meant to be a cooperative approach. And finally, we need in place an audit trail which is what Clause 8 is about how do we monitor ongoing performance in this. Because as with our own business continuity arrangements, we know we have to test, and we know we have to check, and we have to ensure that it's still working. Well, we need the same monitoring and verification going on down our supply chain. And again, the responsibility is back on you to make sure that your supply chain is doing the right things that you need to work and to protect your business, because you're the only ones who are really focused on that. You're the key stakeholder of that business. It's at this point often in the process where it moves away from the procurement team who set up the contract to the operators, who hold the long-term relationship with the supplier. And they're the guys who need to be thinking about how do we continue to monitor this. And it's this regular engagement process throughout that keeps it going. Right, that's my overview for this piece, and I'll come back with a summary in a minute. George, over to you.
Thank you, Duncan Ford, for your update on the development of ISO Draft Technical Specification 22318 Guidance for Supply Chain Continuity. Hello, everyone. I'm George Huff, the Director of Consulting with the Continuity Project. Like Brian and like Duncan, I am a delegate to the new ISO Technical Committee 292 Security. As you know, of course, ISO is an international standard-setting body composed of national standard-setting bodies and promotes worldwide proprietary industrial and commercial standards. So ISO has 163 member nations. In the U.S., the American National Standards Institute, ANSI, is the national standards body. ISO only develops standards for which there is a clear market requirement, and the work is carried out by experts drawn from industrial, technical, and business sectors. An ISO standard represents the global consensus on the state of the art and the subject of that standard. Until December the 31st, ISO's Technical Committee 223, Societal Security, developed the consensus standards that address the challenges an organization or groups of organizations or society may face before, during, and after a disruptive event. Societal security standards integrate multiple disciplines and are aimed at achieving resilience and sustainability through improved management, information sharing, and interoperability. ISO 223 is directly responsible for ISO 22301, the Business Continuity Management System standard. This was a result of years of work by 60 participating countries and is the global flagship management system standard of a series of technical specifications and guidance standards within the definition of societal security, which I'll quickly review in a moment. This afternoon, I'd like to describe to you the 2015 transition of ISO Technical Committee 223 Societal Security and other existing ISO technical committees to ISO Technical Committee 292 Security, including the new technical committee's interim structure and work program. Let's take a look for a moment at the broadened scope of ISO Technical Committee 292. Standardization in the field of security, including but not limited to general security management, business continuity management, resilience and emergency management, fraud countermeasures and controls, security services, and homeland security. A very broad scope. This scope statement can be found at ISO's communications link, which is posted on this slide. It's going to be changed to soon, according to Esa Kurt Gehr of Sweden, who is the secretariat for this particular technical committee. ISO's Technical Management Board made clear that the new 292 is to clarify ISO's structural organization on security managers, but that progress on the existing work items in this sector, the current projects, will continue. The main point is that ISO 292 security is directly responsible now for developing standards in the field of security, including business continuity management, resilience, and emergency management, which are relevant to the work of contingency planners worldwide. This slide sets out the interim structure of the new Technical Committee 292. It's a much broader scope and new scope and necessitates structural changes within the Technical Committee's central structure. First, ISO TC 292 merges 4 existing committees, and the Technical Committee's organization will now consist of 18 work groups and ad hoc groups. Now, these groups will be responsible for a variety of ongoing projects and what they call new work item proposals, a task force, and a developing countries contact group. The 4 existing technical committees are listed here, and they've become a part of ISO TC 292. ISO TC 8, Ships and Marine Technology, was directly responsible for maritime security management systems for supply chains, which is where we're getting some influence. I'll describe the work of ISO TC 223 from 2011 to 2014 more fully in a moment. First, a word about the administration of ISO 292 as to the U.S. positions on standard development. As I mentioned before, ANSI is the U.S. member body to ISO, which accredits U.S. technical advisory groups, or TAGs, whose primary purpose is to develop and transmit by way of ANSI the U.S. position on activities and ballots of the International Technical Committee. ASIS International is a professional organization for security personnel located in Alexandria, Virginia. ANSI appointed ASIS as the U.S. administrator of the new Technical Committee 292 and has already accredited U.S. delegates to the committee. This is a look back for a moment at the work of Technical Committee 223, Societal Security, and it has, which has merged into Technical Committee 292 Security. The work of 223 over the past 4 years amounts to a significant contribution to the discipline of societal security. This is a list of published standards which are currently available for online purchase. As I mentioned before, ISO 22301 is the global flagship requirement standard for BCMS. As we know, it uses simple and straightforward language to summarize the minimum requirements for effective business continuity and can enable coordinated preparedness across diverse organizations around the world. ISO 22301 provides a valuable means of implementing preparedness in an organization and also drives improved business continuity performance into the future. Brian mentioned the page length of the BIA standard. ISO 22301 requirements is also only about 24 pages long. It's an auditable shall and will specification. It offers higher level content. It describes the what, not the how. It has a companion guidance standard, 22313, which is 48 pages and aligns with the clauses and content of requirements. And also, as we see, it's aligning with the other standards in this series. Guidance offers recommendations and permissions and options that organizations can take to implement ISO 22301 requirements. I think the best thing about a standard is quite simple. It's your roadmap. The standard gives you the direction so you can begin your journey, whether it's BCMS, incident response, exercise programs, or partnering arrangements. This is some content that is in our lane, and we should be aware of it. A standard which you should be aware of is ISO Technical Specification 170216, Conformity Assessment. This is a new standard, and you should need to be aware of it when you select an accredited registrar or certification body for conformity assessment of your organization to ISO 22301 BCMS. The popularity of ISO 22301 as a management system is based on the interests of a growing number of organizations in conformity assessment. The ISO 22301 standard is the first international standard that uses ISO's structure for all new and revised management systems. And because of this popularity, ISO recognized the need for strengthening the requirements for competency for registrars and certification bodies and their personnel performing audits of BCMS. The scope of ISO 22301, I think as Brian mentioned, describes that the BCMS standard is applicable to organizations of all types and sizes that wish to either seek certification to BCMS by an accredited third-party certification body or make a self-declaration or self-determination of conformity. So when an organization that you encounter has a business plan that justifies accredited certification of conformity to ISO 22301, you should be able to demonstrate successful alignment and certification to this societal security standard. So be aware that there is this new conformity assessment standard out there, because when you work with organizations, they need to know this when they select registrars. I want to take a few moments to talk about Technical Committee 292's Securities Work Program, and the next three slides set out what they want to achieve in this year and beyond. This slide and the next two slides list the current status of projects and emerging standards. The first here is a management system for private security operation, both requirements and guidance. The other four projects were initiated by Technical Committee 223 prior to this 2015 transition to 292 security. These include revisions of the terminology standard ISO 22300, which contain all of the terms common to this line of ISO societal security standards. Three projects also include organizational resilience, which involved project teams that met this year, as well as BIA and supply chain continuity that we've heard about today. These are also were under development in 2014. I think the main point here is that the new Technical Committee 292 Security is directly responsible for developing standards within these disciplines. The 6 projects on this slide include 5 that were initiated by TC223 this past year, and the first 2 and the 5th are Emergency Management Guidance Project, Public Warning, Color-Coded Alert, and Message Structure for Exchange of Information that are now scheduled for publication in 2015. The NWIP that you see here actually stands for New Work Item Proposal, and it's on facilities with identified hazards. Last is Security, Fraud Risk and Assessment Guidance. This work program slide shows 5 projects that include 3 NWIPs and 2 other standards in development within the discipline of security management. Again, the main point here is that ISO Technical Committee 292 Security is directly responsible for developing standards which are relevant to the work of contingency planners worldwide. I'll turn it back to Brian.
Okay, thanks, George. So I'll go ahead and wrap up and just offer a few more points. You know, the last slide you're going to see in a few moments is includes our email addresses, and especially as if for those that are in the United States, and if you're interested in providing feedback to us on either of the 2 projects, that being BIA or supply chain continuity, I certainly would welcome your feedback. It's going to have a tight time frame to return that feedback, but please reach out and send me an email. I'd be more than happy to get you some content and would again welcome your feedback. But all of us are actively involved in furthering these two projects along as well as others. Again, I want to point out, and one of the key takeaways I hope that you got from at least my part of the presentation was the fact that the BIA, this is really a process standard. It's designed to complement 22301, not replace it, and certainly you can use it even if you subscribe to other standards or other regulatory requirements. So that's something I certainly would hope to leave behind with you. And if we go to the next slide, I think this new standard that we're about to release, again, hopefully that will be in the springtime. It certainly aligns to 22301. It aligns to things like the BCI's good practice guidelines, and it is certainly something that you can look and say, if management says, are we doing the BIA the right way? You can point to this as a benchmark, especially if you've chosen to align your effort to this standard, because it has been vetted and it's certainly had input from many, many different countries and organizations all around the world. Again, the idea here is that we're assessing the effect of a disruptive incident. We're hopefully releasing a statement of business continuity requirements, and very much this is a foundational element of business continuity leading to that strategy piece. Side note, I should have said something well in earlier in the presentation, but the project team, when we talked about the BIA and then leading into the strategy piece, there's certainly something that sits between those two, and that's the gap analysis. The project team, through consensus, suggested that the gap analysis is something that is kind of almost in no man's land. Very important, certainly something that's done all the time when we compare requirements to what currently exists. But the project team ultimately concluded that it was closer to strategy than it was BIA. Now, again, whether you agree with that or disagree, it's not that important for purposes of standards development. The important thing is that I think we all recognize that a gap analysis is important before you try to reinvent the wheel or create strategies where no new strategy is necessary. On the last slide, or at least for me, again, as I mentioned, it's related. The statement of requirements is important, not just recovery time objectives, recovery point objectives, but it's about time, quality, and capability. What is it that the business needs to have when it's recovering from that disruption? Again, not just a time frame and assuming that you need 100%. Again, this is a prerequisite to strategy. It's certainly a prerequisite to a gap analysis, and very, very important. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Duncan. He'll talk a little bit about some of his key points, and then we'll wrap up.
Thanks, Brian. My apologies if the transatlantic cable is putting some additional noise on this circuit. I'll keep my line muted as much as I can. The key point on this one slide, and then moving on to the next, is that, again, as I said, is that 223188 augments the other standards. And I think you can see from what Brian has just been saying that the BIA is usable by anybody. Well, part of the evidence you might want to look for in a supplier is that they've completed a BIA that aligns with 22317. It's good evidence that they're working to the same sorts of standards which you should be using as well. If we go on to the next slide, the main points of 318 is as I said, it's available to everybody. It works for every supplier and every customer. Its aim is to mitigate your risks or the organization's risk of disruption. And what we want is an auditable output which we can use to help to improve the quality of continuity in our supply chain. I think the one other point just to make is that the 22318 is running to a very similar timetable to 317. It's out for comment at the moment, a little bit behind Brian's work, but only by about a month or so. And again, we hope it's going to achieve publication this year, subject to the extent and range of comment we receive on the document, which is gratefully received. Thanks very much indeed. Over to George.
Thanks, Duncan, very much. The main points to take away on this final slide are that ISO Technical Committee 292 Security has a new scope, which is broad enough to include societal security, and the ANSI U.S. Technical Advisory Group to the new ISO Technical Committee 292 Security is actively representing U.S. interests across a wide range of disciplines. The former ISO TC 223 Societal Security has merged into the new technical committee, which is responsible for, and it was responsible for 9 published standards, including ISO 22301 BCMS requirements and guidance 22313, as well as jointly responsible for the new standard on conformity assessment requirements that we need to be mindful of. Finally, ISO TC 292 Communications Group, when it stood up, will provide quick information via ISO's communications network on a new website. So in the interim, use the website that's posted on this slide. And again, we'd like your feedback. ACP invites your immediate feedback on this presentation, so take a moment at the end of today's webinar, please, to complete the pop-up survey. Moderator, Dr. Ed Goldberg, back to you now.
Thanks, George. We have a little bit of time for a question or two, so let's just jump right into that. Can public and private sector organizations that don't rely on ISO 22301 for their continuity of operations plan and business continuity management programs use ISO 22317's BIA process?
Absolutely. I think one of the things we say up front in the scope statement is that large or small, doesn't matter if you're in the United States or elsewhere, public or private sector, there are concepts in here that apply to everyone. One of the things that's perhaps interesting in ISO speak is that we still use the word business, but doesn't mean business in the for-profit sense. So the techniques here certainly can enable public sector service delivery, public sector process work, prioritize set requirements for COOP, that type of thing. So certainly it's applicable in all spaces.
Okay, great. Does the new ISO TC 292 structure enable standards development within the traditional disciplines of contingency planning?
Yeah, this is George. I'll take that. The answer is affirmative, yes. ISO TC 292's interim structure enables ongoing standards development within the disciplines that we've talked about, including emergency management, organizational resilience, BCM. Those are all going to continue without interruption. So, the work's going on, and the project teams are driving to conclusion, particularly on the outstanding projects that we briefed this afternoon. Ed?
Okay, great. Should an organization complete the BIA process before it establishes its strategies to mitigate the impact of disruptions in the supply chain and respond to supply chain disruptions?
I would, at least as it relates, I'll comment on in general, and then I'm sure Duncan can talk about supply chain, but I think the short answer is yes. I mean, it's the same thing as this gives you your business requirements, and then you need to design around those. So the BIA is very much looking at what are the requirements in terms of, whether, again, downtime, capability, quality once you recover. And then you need to figure out how you're going to go do that. And so it's a natural follow-on, again, for all resources. I suspect Duncan will say the same for supply chain. But with that, Duncan, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I certainly certainly don't disagree in that you can't start the supply chain work until you've decided what is important to you, which requires the BIA work to be done. I think equally what one would encourage people is to think about starting, as you start the plan, you can be setting the priorities quite quickly, and they should run together. What is important to you should also be the same elements that you're pushing out to the supply chain, saying that is important. So it's not in any way to say that you can run these completely in parallel. You need the output from the BIA, but equally, while you're trying to sort out some of the detail in your own, don't stop doing the work in the other direction.
Good. Okay, so just to be respectful of folks' time, if you'll stick on the line for another 20 seconds, 30 seconds, I've got some information you'll find useful. So thank you for attending today's program and webinar. And before that, I especially want to thank our presenters, Brian Zawada, Duncan Ford, and George Huff. Guys, great presentation. Thank you so much. And I'd also like to thank ADG and their webinar experts for their support of our series. And thanks once again to Continuity Housing for sponsoring the entire ACP webinar series. Please remember to visit continuityhousing.com or leave a comment in the survey if you're interested in how they can provide your critical employees guaranteed housing when they need it most. If you like the webinar, again, please tell your friends. Go to the ACP website, and there's also future webinar information there. As a reminder, this and previous webinars are recorded, and they're available on that ACP website. Please feel free to share the link to the recordings with your peers and anyone that you think might benefit from it. You'll receive a link to the recording after the webinar via email, along with additional information on the topical content. And as George mentioned, there'll be a very brief survey about this webinar that'll pop up when you close your browser. Please take half a minute to answer the questions. It really helps us refine these productions and pick topics. Thank you, and have a great day.